Madam President,
The Senator from New Jersey.
I ask unanimous consent that the quorum call be vitiated.
Without objection.
Madam President, is there a time limitation?
There is not.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, I rise today to support the Lilly Ledbetter Fair Pay Act in order to defend the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and to protect all Americans from the evils of discrimination. Yesterday, millions of Americans rejoiced as Barack Obama was sworn in as the 44th President of the United States. Hope for a more inclusive America, a more unified America, a more just America swept across this land from our biggest cities to our smallest towns. There was a sense of wonderment that someone who wouldn't have been allowed to eat in certain restaurants or drink from certain water fountains just over 40 years ago had just become the freely elected leader of the greatest country on earth. We should be incredibly proud of the progress we've made since the eras of slavery and Jim Crow. But while we believe our union can be perfected, we know it still isn't perfect. We know that equal opportunity and impartial justice for all have yet to be attained. And we know what the consequences are. For as Dr. King so eloquently put in his letter from a Birmingham jail, where he said, quote, "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere." Despite the progress we've made, we live in a country where women still earn 78 cents for every dollar a man makes, where African Americans earn only 80 cents for every dollar a white man makes, and Latinos earn only 68 cents for every dollar a white man makes. Our country, therefore, is still far from perfect. Today, the Senate has a historic opportunity to narrow the gap between our ideals and our practices. We have the opportunity to say that women should be treated the same as men. We have the opportunity to say that people should be fairly paid for their labor. And we have the opportunity to loudly proclaim in a unified voice that discrimination will not be tolerated in America. As of last year, after a misguided Supreme Court decision overturned what had been the law of the land for decades, a worker can't bring an action for wage discrimination if the original decision to discriminate happened more than 180 days beforehand. The Supreme Court said employers can get away with discrimination if they hide it long enough, even though the effects of that bigotry have no expiration date. The Lilly Ledbetter Fair Pay Act would recognize long-term, continuous, systemic discrimination as it really is, and not let offending companies get away with it through loopholes and disinformation. If a woman sees her wages continuously fall behind those of her male counterparts, or a worker gets paid a wage far lower than the company average just because he's black, they should be able to challenge their employers even if the original decision to discriminate was made years ago. Narrowly defining discrimination as merely the original decision to discriminate makes no sense at all. Let's say, for example, that a criminal hacks into your bank account and decides to steal a portion of your paycheck every 2 weeks. If we were to apply a precedent similar to the Ledbetter case, if the hacker doesn't get caught 180 days after the initial decision to hack in, he can keep stealing forever with no fear of prosecution. Current discrimination law makes about that much sense. Now, some of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle will ask why workers often don't file their claim within 180 days from the first instance of discrimination. Well, there are several reasons. To begin with, workers generally find it difficult to compare their salaries to co-workers, and many businesses actually prohibit it. Even if a worker sees her pay is lower than her co-workers, She might not recognize it was a result of discrimination. And if workers do recognize it as discrimination, they often wait to contact the EEOC, the Economic Opportunity Commission, or decide not to due to feeling ashamed, or more often, they feel retaliation by their company. They fear the consequences of rocking the boat and figure a job in which they are discriminated against is better than being fired and having no job at all. And certainly in these incredibly tough economic times, that is a rising reality. To make matters worse, skyrocketing unemployment rates have only put these vulnerable workers in a more precarious and often helpless position. Now, some of my Republican colleagues will also argue this legislation will open up the floodgates, leading to thousands of lawsuits claiming wage discrimination. But this argument simply has no merit. For over 40 years, the courts have interpreted the Civil Rights Act of 1964 to be consistent with the Lilly Ledbetter Fair Pay Act. 8 out of 9 appellate courts interpreted it that way. Yet there was no flood of litigation then, nor will there be after we enact this vital piece of legislation into law. Now, some of my conservative colleagues will argue this legislation would make companies liable for decades of back pay and would encourage workers to intentionally delay and file claims years later when those accused might no longer be around to defend themselves. Again, these arguments simply ignore the facts. Under this legislation, back pay would be capped at 2 years, regardless of how long the victim was discriminated against, and the burden to prove discrimination took place is borne by the worker. Any lack of witnesses available to testify would only hurt the workers' efforts to prove their case. Now, critics who say this legislation will cripple businesses miss the point. In fact, that companies that follow the law are currently put at a competitive disadvantage compared to those who exploit their workers. As the executive director of the U.S. Women's Chamber of Commerce said, a strong business advocacy group, they succinctly noted, the Lilly Ledbetter Fair Pay Act rewards those who play fair, including women business owners, unlike the Supreme Court's decision, which seems to give an unfair advantage to those who skirt the rules. So, in fact, we have a strong business advocacy group saying, treat those who are, in fact, obeying the law and as it was intended and as it, in fact, has been pursued for over 4 decades in a way that doesn't put us at a competitive disadvantage. The vast majority of businesses that practice legal hiring procedures will not have to change anything and will no longer be punished for doing the right thing. Wage discrimination is real, and the Fair Pay Act would strike a clear blow against it. So we have to make sure to keep the legislation strong. Unfortunately, I'm afraid the amendment offered by our colleague from Texas, Senator Hutchinson, would severely undermine it. That amendment would require people to prove that they had no reason to suspect their employer was discriminating against them in 180 days. The amendment is pretty confusing just on its face. I have to ask, how does an employee prove she doesn't suspect discrimination? And when should she have to? In general, I don't see how it's relevant whether a victim suspects discrimination or not. The issue is whether there is discrimination or not. If it's happening, it has to be stopped, plain and simple. You can't ultimately be in a position in which you are allowed to discriminate and get away with it. If we send that message in our society, then all the progress we have made will be rolled back. Madam President, I'd like to believe that every member of this body champions the principles of equality, justice, and liberty as much as I do. Principles are meaningless without practice. without vigilantly ensuring that no person is discriminated because of their gender, their race, their religion, their ethnicity, or sexual orientation, our principles become just empty words. I'd like to remind my colleagues that inaction on this issue is akin to tacit acceptance. And as Dr. King said, quote, "We will remember not the words of our enemies, but the silence of our friends." I urge my colleagues to remember those wise words and put votes where their values are by supporting this vital piece of civil rights legislation. I want to thank my distinguished colleague from Maryland for leading the charge here. She has been an exceptional fighter on this issue, and I know that she will soon see the fruits of her labor, not for herself and her advocacy, but for millions of women, Latinos, and African Americans who find themselves discriminated in this country and who in fact deserve the ability for all to be able to enjoy the fruits of their labor without such discrimination. And I thank my distinguished colleague from Minnesota for allowing me to move forward here in this process at this time. And with that, I yield the floor.